inviting me. It's great to be here. It's also good to sit through Enrique's talk. I learned a lot about sort of that breaking research, so that's great. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about mobility, challenges in MS, and the importance of mobility. I know you've been sitting for a while, so if you feel like you need to stand or move the arms around or something, feel free, because I know it's been a little bit of a run here, and we'll talk about that a little bit today. What am I doing? Oh yeah, here. About the importance of, one of the things we'll talk about is the importance of breaking up that sedentary time. So whether it's moving the arms or just stretching or getting up, we'll talk about that. So we'll talk about primary and secondary causes of mobility, kind of give an overview. That could be a whole sort of day topic, and some of the impact of decreased mobility. And then we'll talk about factors that can affect mobility and common sort of general approaches that we'll take in physical therapy. So I probably, a lot of people are familiar with this, is that when we think about decreased mobility, often we think about ability to walk, and problems with walking are very, very common in MS. So probably at least 70% of people with MS have some difficulty walking. In addition to having difficulty walking, it also, for most people, tends to be kind of the hardest part about having MS, is not being able to get around as well. And then it doesn't just put a burden on the individual who has MS, but sometimes it can also put a burden on family members or caregivers. And so it's just a really impactful problem that's very important, and that we're always trying to figure out better ways to address. So problems with mobility can be caused by lots of factors. We can think about primary factors that might come directly from the disease itself, like weakness or visual problems, balance problems, fatigue, lots of different things that come from the disease that can contribute to mobility problems. And then we can also think about secondary factors, right? So if your balance is really bad, you might have in the top corner, there's like a fear of mobility or a fear of falling. If you don't move a limb for a long time, you could get a contracture, which then makes range of motion even more difficult and can limit mobility. Pain can be a primary problem, I suppose, as well. But so there's sort of this mix of primary and secondary factors that we're thinking about when you come into physical therapy. And the impact of decreased mobility can be really devastating, right? So we think about sometimes this sort of cyclical, it's a negative cyclical process where you have less mobility, then you have less activity, and then because of that, you're doing less and become less deconditioned, and that just feeds right back into being less mobile and results in essentially worse quality of life, right? Doing less, socializing less, having maybe overall worse health. And so we're really interested in trying to break that cycle however we can. And there's been a ton of research in this area, and we think that up to about 80% of people with MS don't get enough physical activity. And we'll talk about kind of what that means here in a couple slides. And then this is kind of what I was talking about before. So sitting time, okay? So there's been other studies that have looked at kind of the opposite, not just how much physical activity people are getting, but the opposite, how much people are sitting all day, right? And so we think that about 62% of the day, people with MS might be sitting, okay? And so that's another way we can think about just breaking up that negative cycle, increasing physical activity, or just decreasing the amount of sedentary time. So even if you stay sitting and it's difficult to stand, moving the arms, moving the body in some way can help break up that cycle. And so here I have that compared to kind of typical sitting times in sort of the average US adult. And you can see that, you know, a lot of us sit around 50% of the day. and it's a little bit more for people with MS. Okay, so with that in mind, when you come into physical therapy, this seems pretty simple, and it is in some ways, right? Is we kind of are thinking two things when we're coming in with your mobility for physical therapy evaluation related to your mobility, right? So if your mobility is low or impaired and your physical activity is low, we want to figure out ways to improve that. Okay, again, seems very basic, and on some level it is. And if your mobility and physical activity is adequate, we still actually like to do those evaluations. Maybe you wouldn't need to come into physical therapy very often or more than once every year or two. But we want to make sure we have ways that you can maintain that mobility and avoid that decline so you don't get into that sort of negative cycle of decreased mobility and deconditioning. And then very broadly, right? So I think the important thing to note here is that these are broad approaches that we'll consider for physical therapy. It's really hard to sort of prescribe individually without doing sort of that personalized, individualized evaluation. But we think about three broad strategies. We think about remediation, or trying to fix the problem. We think about prevention, right? And sort of keeping more bad things from happening. And then we also think about compensation. So figuring out other ways to keep you mobile, essentially. So when we think about remediation, there's been lots of research into how we can improve certain aspects of impairments related to MS. These are the three most common areas that are studied. And so there's lots of evidence showing that people with MS can improve muscle strength, can improve your aerobic capacity or your endurance, and then can improve your balance. So you'll often hear people talk about trying to exercise and improve and focus on these three areas, okay? And we know all of those things relate to mobility, and then if we improve them, can improve mobility as well. So this is just a summary of what we've come to call the Canadian Physical Activity and Exercise Guidelines. It was developed by a Canadian group and by the Canadian MS Society. It's almost 10 years old now. It's nothing groundbreaking, but it took a look at all the evidence at the time. And here, I think I have it, summarized in a little bigger font. And again, it's nothing groundbreaking, but it did show that when they took all that evidence together, all the studies that had been done at the time, that doing 30 minutes of moderate intensity aerobic activity and doing some sort of strength training twice a week, each modality, can lead to improvements in mobility, okay? So that oftentimes becomes a starting point for what we might try to help people do when we're thinking about improving their mobility. And then balance training can take many forms, right? This is often, all this is very much individualized to what someone's impairments are and how they're presenting and how impaired mobility is. But we know that different types of balance training can improve balance, okay? So pretty simply. And again, we know that all of these three things together can really make a big difference in mobility, right? So you think about strength, the strength that you need to get up and move around, the endurance you might need for walking longer distances, and then balance we need in many different activities when we're turning and looking around or walking over different types of uneven surfaces, okay? So remediation is definitely on the table, right, when you're coming into physical therapy as a way to improve mobility. And again, this is an individualized process, right? So if we do think it's really important to go see a physical therapist who has some experience with working with people who have MS to identify specific problems, specific goals, develop sort of that custom program. It doesn't mean you're always going to be having to come in every week or something, but figuring out a plan. And then knowing kind of what your goals are and doing so in a measurable way so you know if you're on track or not. Okay, so talked about remediation. Sort of the next broad strategy that we think about is prevention. So with prevention, we are concerned about maintaining your current level of mobility and preventing further loss of mobility, okay? Also, one of the big things that we're interested in is preventing falls, okay? We do not want people to fall. Those falls can be devastating. And we want to prevent, as best we can, other types of complications from interfering with your mobility and safety. Okay, so kind of getting back to those physical activity guidelines, they're not much different for people who have MS than the rest of people, right? So we can follow and sort of think about the World Health Organization guidelines that we should try to be getting about 150 minutes a week of moderate intensity exercise. So that might look like 20 minutes a day, or 75 minutes a week of vigorous intensity exercise. And what I like this slide comes from the World Health Organization, or this picture, is that this doesn't have to be walking. It doesn't have to be running. It doesn't have to be a formal sport or exercise, right? If you're doing things around the house or around the yard, or just sometimes your daily activities can result in getting at least some of that moderate intensity activity. The big thing is the intensity, right? So when we think about light to moderate activity, we're thinking about things where you're starting to breathe a little heavily, but not out of breath. And you can still have a conversation, but it can become more challenging over time. And then vigorous activity really is where you're more sort of out of breath, hard to have a conversation, okay? And so it also doesn't have to be like really long bouts of activity, right? So you can achieve these goals of, like, say, moderate intensity activity by doing 5 or 10 minutes at a time. So again, a lot of this you can sort of hash out in with your physical therapist, but these are good goals to keep in mind. And then when we are trying to improve people's mobility and physical activity, we want to do so safely. So like I said, it doesn't have to be a walking program, particularly if you walk a lot, you get really tired and you might fall. Okay, so there's other ways that we can think about exercising with different exercise equipment, the pool, or again, just might be able to do that with your sort of daily activities that you're already doing. Other ways that we think about prevention, we think about stretching, right, as a way to, if you're not moving a muscle a lot or a joint a lot, it will sort of tighten up over time. And then this happens a lot at the ankle. And then that can be difficult to sort of walk with, and you might trip over that. So stretching can be a big thing. Exercise is actually a really good way to manage pain. So like preventing pain and managing pain, exercise, once you sort of get into that routine, can be very helpful. And then a really common one is different strategies. Oftentimes it's bracing and assistive devices that could help to prevent falls, right? That's always on our minds as physical therapists. Okay, and then the last sort of big area that we like to think about is compensation. So compensation is simply, we want to adapt how you get around or the environment you get around in order to maintain your mobility and independence or your ability to participate in society. And so oftentimes, right, this is not the direction that everyone wants to go first, because oftentimes this does include using assistive devices, using canes, using walkers, maybe using wheelchairs or braces. But the importance of maybe keeping that mobility up so you can still participate and not falling, right? These can be really effective ways to do that. So canes, walkers, maybe braces to prevent foot drop. These are all ways that we think about compensating to keep you mobile and keep you moving. Sometimes it could be a wheelchair, different things you can use around the home to maintain independence. adaptations you can make to the actual structure of your house, if possible, to help maintain that independence. Other ways we think about compensating is, again, like I mentioned, you don't have to, we always think sometimes about exercising in these 20, 30-minute, 45-minute bouts. It doesn't necessarily have to be that long, right? So exercising in shorter bouts to prevent fatigue, like just avoiding things you know are going to exacerbate your fatigue or put you at risk for falls. Okay, and then I just have a few, again, just sort of broad examples to sort of put these concepts together. So this could be a scenario where you come into physical therapy, we decide, hey, let's compensate for your ankle weakness and that foot drop by using that orthotic device, maybe using a cane, so that you can still walk without limping or favoring that leg as much, and it's safer and it's going to be more efficient. But in the meantime, let's try to focus on improving the strength at your knee and your hip to, again, continue to improve that walking ability. And because we put you in a brace, that ankle's not moving as much, let's stretch that ankle so we prevent a contracture from happening. Okay, pretty simple. Another example might be come in with a balance problem. We decide, hey, I think we can fix this. Might take a few months of regular physical therapy, but we'll train and try to improve your balance. In the meantime, or maybe for a long time, we'll employ some compensation strategies. For example, you get really dizzy in crowds or when in a store during the busiest time. So we'll try to think about ways you can avoid doing those types of activities. And maybe at least while we're trying to remediate your balance, hey, let's try using this cane so that you actually don't fall and create more problems. And then one more example would be maybe we have to, maybe we recommend that you would benefit from using a wheelchair, right? Instead of trying to walk around because there's lots of falls and it's just difficult. But we'll remediate that upper body strength by strengthening arms and maybe doing some trunk strengthening, and then try to prevent any further deconditioning by doing some aerobic activity as well. So really the goal of physical therapy, right? We think about all these different approaches, sort of improving things when we can. That's typically the first route, right? Adapting as we need to, okay, to keep you mobile, and then trying to prevent as much as we can any type of functional decline in mobility. Hopefully that starts to contribute to improving quality of life. Okay, that's all I have.